Knowledge in crisis.
The podcast. This is part 1 of our 2-part episode with Béatrice Longuenesse.
Hello and welcome to the Knowledge in Crisis podcast. My name is Tuomo Tiisala. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna.
And my name is Katharina Kraus. I'm a professor of the philosophy of the Enlightenment and modernity, also at the University of Vienna.
And today we are joined by Béatrice Longuenesse, who is Professor Emerita at New York University. Welcome, Béatrice.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
The topic of our discussion today is the unconscious mind. Can you say something about your interest in this topic?
I'm indeed very interested in the unconscious mind. I am also interested in the conscious mind and the kind of unconscious states or activities I'm interested in are the kinds of states that can be conscious but are not conscious. The reasons why and the ways in which, and there are very many different ways in which, a mental state that could be conscious is not conscious.
The most natural way to think about the unconscious mental states is by way of thinking about what it is for something to be conscious. Ordinarily, we think of consciousness as consciousness of an object, but we also think of consciousness as a feeling. So what I feel right now, sitting here doing the interview, is not really about any particular object, but it is nonetheless something we call consciousness. So is it correct that we can define unconscious states by way of a contrast to these two different ways of thinking about what is conscious?
Yes, that is one way to think of unconscious as a contrast to these two kinds of consciousness. At least that's what we philosophers who think about consciousness today think, that the most basic kind of conscious is the feeling, the one that is not directed at anything in particular. And you can have it without it being a conscious, as you said, of something. And the continuing state is, as it were, you direct the feeling at something. So there are those two kinds. Generally, they exist together, but they can be separate. And especially the most basic feeling can exist without our having a clear idea of what its intentional object is, or even whether it has any.
And what is an intentional object?
Yes, you're right to ask me, because I use the term without defining it. It's exactly the consciousness of. That's the intentionality. That object we have consciousness of.
Moving to the unconscious, you are specifically interested in the unconscious insofar as it could be conscious. In a sense, the unconscious is the not conscious, that which is not conscious. A stone is not conscious, but we don't say that there is something unconscious in this stone. Or which aspect of consciousness contrasts with your notion of the unconscious?
So there are two ways in which states which were conscious can become unconscious, depending on whether you are considering what we were calling the feeling, the what its likeness of a state, or whether you consider its object. Most of our mental states, those states that can be conscious, they don't stay conscious very long, because you think of something, but then you immediately start thinking about something else. So what happened to the previous state? Well, it disappears or stays in memory. And memory or memory states, they're not states we are conscious of. And that's the first way in which a state, which could be conscious, is unconscious. Those kinds of states that are unconscious, just in virtue of being not currently present, but stored in memory, they're often very, very close to being conscious again. They can be immediately recalled in association with something that we have now present to the mind. So they're not currently present, but they're immediately available to consciousness. And then there are others who go either far deeper into the recesses of our memory and will be harder just for that reason to retrieve. And now comes the real complications. There are other states for which it looks like or it feels like there's something that prevents us to even recall them. And if we can't recall them, how do we know they're there? And that's the kind of unconscious state I'm most interested in. The most classic case is the kinds of state that you may gradually be confronted with when you're, for instance, in psychotherapy, and you realize that your current suffering may be related to something you cannot exactly formulate, but that's there. Something in you is preventing you from quite getting at, but it's there.
It sounds like we're going to have a conversation about Freud and psychoanalysis, not only because we are less than 5 minutes from Freud's former home in Vienna and the practice where he received patients, but also because this has been one of the key interests of your recent research. So it's Freud and Kant, two very different thinkers that you have been particularly interested in. Can you say why these two thinkers, why did you choose them?
In a way, I didn't choose them, they chose me. That's often what happens in philosophy. You think about a question and an author strikes you as having thought very deeply about that question. But it is paradoxical to put the focus especially on those two authors. So one of them, Immanuel Kant, is an 18th century philosopher, so belonging to that period that Katharina, in her research, as she was telling us, is especially interested in the Enlightenment. And he's a philosopher who was especially interested in both what our capacity for reasoning is capable of achieving, how we can reason through our life, what we can know or cannot know, what we ought to do and why. And all of this trying to reason, to not let people sort of just be driven by fantasy or imagination, but really use your logical capacities and also your self-control capacities in a way to lead your life. Interestingly enough, he was also interested in the threat of madness, but that was not the focus of his research. He was focused on the other side, not how we can be mad, but what can we do with our reason? And Freud is in some ways in a big contrast with that. He's a 19th and early 20th century thinker who was primarily psychotherapist. He first was a neurologist and then realized that a lot of the therapies he was trying to exercise needed another type of therapy than just, treating the body or treating the brain, which was in any case at a very elementary state. That new kind of therapeutic practice, which consisted in talking with the patient. And that's how he came upon really a new type of diagnosis of what's going on in our mind, precisely what we do not control. Whereas Kant, while being very aware of the limits of what our reason can do, was all about, okay, what should we try to control and how can we do that? So we have those two poles, and in a very interesting way, they're in dialogue with one another.
Let's stay with the first figure. Let's stay with Immanuel Kant for a while. You already indicated that Kant is much more known for self-control, for reason. Famously, he develops in his theoretical philosophy, in his first critique, the critique of pure reason, a fundamental theory of knowledge and of what can be known, but also of the boundaries of knowledge. Mm-hmm. Can you explore this a little bit in his theoretical philosophy? Mm-hmm. What is the role of the unconscious? Mm-hmm. And I'm in particular thinking about the unconscious synthesis of the imagination and where he really assigns a particular role to the unconscious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is indeed one of the points. And what is very interesting and quite new for his period in Kant was that he defended the view that our imagination, and especially the way it functions when it helps our reasoning about an issue, it is essentially buried, as he said, in the depth of our minds, and we are mostly unconscious of it. If we try to figure out how we get, if you like, from point A to point B in thinking about something, we realize that something has to have gone on in between the two stages that we were not aware of. Some process must have led from one to the other. And that process was unconscious. And that's the process of imagination. Imagine there's on this table a vase and there's a bunch of flowers and they're wilted. And I say, oh, my poor flowers, they're in really bad shape. Why do I say that? because there was present to my mind, ready to be drawn from it, the image of the previous state of the flowers. I know those very flowers were only yesterday beautiful blooming flowers. One is perceived, the other remembered. But how is there a connection between the two? Because my imagination can now go through all the stages those two flowers had to go through to get to the present stage. That's the work of imagination. And of course, it is now reinforced by the fact I can reason about this. Of course, there's a reason flowers do lose their bloom when you let them too long without water. So imagination sort of comes to support the reasoning I can have. I imagine those various stages. And I know I'm not fantasizing because now I can reason about what has been going on. And he says we would never reason unless we had all those ongoing images in our mind that are connected to one another. And what does that, the connecting imagination?
I'm not sure I understand yet what is the unconscious element. Because if I have the flowers in front of me and I have a memory of the flowers from yesterday, these are images I have, and these are images of those flowers. Mm-hmm. So I am conscious of the flowers. So how is this an example of something being unconscious?
The present image is conscious. The image I had yesterday was conscious. The storage of the image of yesterday in my memory is unconscious. It remained there, but I was not having it present to mind. So already the very fact of connecting those two images relies on the persistence of an image somewhere where I don't see it in a way.
Okay,
my memory.
Okay, great. Now, I think I'm beginning to get a hang of it. So otherwise I would be able to have consciousness only of objects that are in front of me right now. Mm-hmm. Of course, we take it for granted that we can have consciousness of objects that we have seen yesterday or maybe never saw. This is so familiar to us that we don't really usually think about it. Mm-hmm. But Kant is interested in the kinds of processing and the storage and the direction of attention and the use of memory as a capacity that enables us to combine the pictures or representations right now and at other times.
And we all make an experience even much simpler than my case of the flowers. So in this case, there is a kind of unconscious play of the imagination. I connect a present image to an image that is not now present consciously to my mind, but that connection is related to a question I'm asking myself, what happened to these flowers? And I use the capacity of imagination to both keep and process images in the service of a deliberate reasoning about these present flowers. There are much more elementary cases where I'm not controlling anything, where, for instance, I'm walking on a path and suddenly an image crops in my mind which has absolutely nothing to do, or apparently, with what I'm seeing now, and I'm not asking myself anything. I'm just precisely in a state of floating attention, enjoying my walk, and then suddenly the image of my mother comes to my mind. And then I remember that I walked with her in a very similar path. That's a play of imagination, namely bringing back an image to my mind. What it is an image of is not present. I don't have my mother next to me, yet I think about her. My imagination revives an image just by association with the present image. And this kind of association goes on all the time in our mind. Even that was another very forceful statement of Kant. Every single one of our current perception is inhabited by imagination. Otherwise, we wouldn't put it together the way we do. We use what we've perceived in the past to help us sort of shape the current image we have and recognize it. Say, oh yeah, this is a table. I know what a table is. It seems simple. It seems something, it's obvious. This is a table. Yeah, but it's not that simple to recognize an object as a table. I have to have seen similar objects in the past, which are also dissimilar, among which I do recognize common features that make all of them tables. This is both imagination reviving past images, but it's also reviving them in the service of recognizing now the object for what it is. So it's a much more complex event in my mind than we might think, because it all goes on very, very fast, not at the level of consciousness.
So according to Kant, even the concept of table is made out of many, many conscious and unconscious parts.
Made possible by,
All concepts have to be put together from pieces like this. And some of them are unconscious.
Yes, but moreover, now we go really further in, and you're right to lead us there into what is deeper in Kant's view of what is unconscious. Namely, there are ways of ordering all that material which is now present to my mind, but put it together with what is not anymore present to my mind, that we have deeply seated in our mind without being conscious of them, like a thing, a table, and what are its characteristics? It's yellow, it has 4 feet. So I have the capacity to always look for, in all that multiplicity of information I get constantly, look for some structures, like think, characteristic of that thing, how a thing changes, and nevertheless remains the same thing. These ways of ordering, they're unconscious, but they're working. And then they can be made conscious when I say, yes, this is a thing, and this is the properties of the thing. I'm making explicit in words the general representations which we call concept, the type of structuring, the thing and its properties, that was always already as a way of ordering my perceptual information, my perceptions. It was already always present in my mind without my being conscious of it. And so Kant went much further than had been done before in trying to show, again, there's so much that goes on in our mind for even the most elementary current, present representation than we are aware of.
I would like to come back to your example of the vase of flowers. You already indicated the multiplicity of things that are going on around the vase, in this room, the different voices, the different images, people. But the concepts we've already acquired in the course of our lives guide us in how we focus our attention. I was wondering, where in this story you have given us, is there space for some controlled focusing of attention to the flowers in particular, out of this multiplicity of impressions you get?
Actually, again, that too is there all the time, even without our being aware that this is what we're doing, we nevertheless do it, focus our attention. And actually, I can give a very simple example, which I also think we don't always become aware of, but in some cases we're pretty well aware of. When you wake up in the morning, first of all, this is something that will happen to you without your controlling it. There's suddenly some big noise outside, the trash truck is coming through the street, and boom, you're awakened. That happens to you. You're affected by that noise. It changes your state. Then you start wondering, especially if you were deeply asleep or deep in a dream, you start wondering, where am I? It takes an effort of the mind, even an elementary one, to start orienting. Oh yeah, this is right, this is left, my bed is here. Oh yeah, this is the wall and I recognize And then, even when I say this is the wall and I recognize my cabinet, you're already taking, as it were, control of all that mass of information that is affecting you, not only ordering the elements, but interpreting them. That's something you do. So there's what you have to have initial, really elementary ways of being affected by your environment. But any kind of attention is a way of controlling that information and putting it together. And that's not something you receive. That's something you do.
It sounds as if Kant is very optimistic about the unconscious, in a way that we can bring a lot of it to a concept, we can bring a lot to our attention if we want to. Would you agree to this? Or?
Yes and no. I think yes and no. Namely, also there are different aspects of the way Kant thinks about the mind, and that's where perhaps we will get closer to how we get to the kinds of questions that then become prevalent for Freud. What we best know of Kant's work, what he is best known for, is what we call his 3 critiques. The critique of pure reason, which is interested in how it is possible for us to come up with not only perceptual knowledge, but how from there we get to some much more complex kinds of knowledge, mathematical knowledge, Newtonian physical science. How is that possible? And so Kant, in that first critique, is interested in that. And at the same time, it's called the critique of pure reason, because he constantly reminds us that, yes, this extremely powerful use we have of our reasoning capacities always has to come back to what we receive through the senses. So there's constantly this back and forth. So there is control, and we have to at the same time be, as it were, the servants of nature. And nature presents itself to us in certain ways, and we don't choose which concept we're going to apply and how, even though the application depends on us. We have to, as another philosopher, Plato, had said, find the right way to cut nature at its joint. We have the tools for that, but, we have to do it in the right way. So that's the first. Control, but also lack thereof. The second is called the critique of practical reason, namely the answer not to the question, what can we know, but what should we do? And there, Kant is much more optimistic, to take your term, about what reason can achieve on its own, and indeed should try to achieve on its own, without being subservient to anything else, including nature, and especially nature. We have the power of being from our own will, and our will and our capacity to make something happen because we have represented it to ourselves as something that should happen. That's our will. And there he thinks there are certain kinds of questions that only reason on its own can answer. That's very optimistic. And that's certainly the area in which, when we reach that next character in my story, we need to think harder about whether we can be that optimistic.
So before we get to the next character with Freud, I would like to complicate the optimistic picture just a little bit, because Kant is also famous for saying some things that are quite radical about the limits that we have on our self-understanding or self-knowledge as rational beings. So Kant says, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he says that we can never know what the principle of action is when we act. So we think we know what we are trying to do, but actually we can't know it. Is that optimistic, or what do you think?
First of all, I don't think that is exactly right. When we give ourselves a particular goal, I want to be a good violinist, so I should practice my scales. I mean, I know what I want to achieve. I want to be a good violinist, and I know how I should do that. But you're absolutely right. The cases that interest Kant the most in that second critique, the critique of practical reason. So, for instance, Kant thinks we all know what our moral duty is. He may be right or he may be wrong. Deeply entrenched in any human being, as a rational being, as a being capable of guiding themselves by reason, is what he calls the moral law. We know in very general terms what is the way we ought to act, especially in connection with other human beings. We ought to respect them. We ought not to do something to which they could not possibly assent, especially in our treatment of them. And we ought, as much as we can, as it were, live as if we were all rational beings, dialogue with one another, and together achieve common goals. We know that that would be the ideal way. What we never know, and that there I come to agree with you, we may constantly kid ourselves that we have this very altruistic way of guiding our action in connection with other human beings, when in fact we are actually acting in our own interest. And very often we may cover up our own egoism. I mean, the fact that, we all we want to live. We want to live happy. We want to achieve sometimes extremely high goals, but without having to worry too much about, what it does to others. We will say, oh, but really I'm doing this for others, when really I'm doing it for myself. We never really know whether there's not a very deep-seated self-interest. We do know we should do that, whether we actually are governed by that main concern, we can never be sure of. That's pessimistic, yeah, that is pessimistic.
But even in this case of deciding to play the violin, how do I know that this is my goal really? Or how do I know what the reason is to pursue this goal rather than to become a pianist or rather than to become a medical doctor.
Yeah, that is quite right. There is something, he thinks, that is deeply unknown about what my ultimate nature is as a thinking being, and that goes also, in fact, for the thinking that goes on in cognition. What is it about me that makes me capable of not just following my instinct, but actively reason through either something I'm trying to know, or even more radically, make a choice rather than another? Well, I know in each particular case I want this, so I should do that, but what makes me want this? Ultimately, even that I don't know. And that, of course, then there's more connection in that respect between the case of, I know the goal, this will be my means, and the case of, I'm never sure whether I'm really acting on the moral motivation. Mm-hmm. Well, they join at the root, as it were. I never know what kind of being I am most deeply and what makes me choose one thing rather than another. For Kant, there is a deep mystery in that way, in the nature of a human being. It is very strange because at the same time he says all questions in philosophy boil down to that one. What is a human being? And well, at the deepest level, what is a human being? He thinks we cannot know.
This was part 1 of our 2-part episode on the unconscious mind with Béatrice Longuenesse. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back with part 2 in July. This podcast has received funding from the Austrian Science Fund as part of the Knowledge in Crisis project. We're a collaboration of more than 50 philosophers at the University of Graz, the University of Salzburg, the University of Vienna, and are led by Central European University. For more information about our research and details about upcoming public events, visit www.knowledgeincrisis.com. You can also find us on most social media platforms at Knowledge Crisis. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.